Welcome to Moments That Matter. This podcast was created because we want to look at the moments in our lives that come along time to time that have long-term consequences, and especially those moments having to do with the choice of vocation. In his book, Let Your Life Speak, Parker Palmer talks about the Clearness Committee tradition of the Quakers, in which older, wiser people sort of surround someone making a life decision, and they help them through that sort of questioning process to clarify the direction that that person should go. Unfortunately, we don't mostly have these clearness committees, but we do have what I call clearness committee moments that come along that, if we're paying attention to them, can direct us and keep us, perhaps even keep us on the path that we're on. So we'll relay stories from our lives, from the lives of others, and the hope is that as we do this, that perhaps even these moments that you have experienced will become clearer for you. And so today we are joined by Keene. And Ann is joining us by Zoom from Austin, Texas. Ann is an author. She is a journalism graduate from UNC Chapel Hill. And she is the author of a new book called The Cloudbuster 9. And it's about a lot of things. But among those things is a story of her father and his connection to a baseball team that represented the Navy during World War II from the pre-flight school in Chapel Hill. And up until writing her book, she had been a ghostwriter for 25 years. She had been writing speeches and opinion editorials, among other things. I heard Ann speak in Greenville, South Carolina, at a book talk, and I was immediately captivated by the topic of her book because I had attended UNC Chapel Hill, I had served in the Navy, and I'm a huge baseball fan. And so she basically ticked all of the boxes for me, and I was very excited to hear about the book and all of her research that had gone into the book. So I was especially intrigued by how Ann got involved in the writing of the book, and all of those various topics. And so that's what we kind of want to get into, among other things that we will talk about today. So welcome, Ann.
Thank you very much.
So can you tell us a bit about your upbringing and your preparation at Chapel Hill?
Well, I was born in Shelby, North Carolina, but I was primarily raised in Hickory. And growing up, I was actually a swimmer, so I ended up going away to boarding school at Mercersburg Academy in Pennsylvania just to get some better training. And there I had thought about swimming in college. I ended up not doing so, but my parents both went to Carolina, so I came from a line of graduates there. They met there. My mother's here visiting right now from North Carolina. But again, I had grown up going to football games with my parents as a child, so a long-term Tar Heel, and consider myself extremely lucky, extremely privileged to have gone to school there. I can tell you that. So, yes.
And you went through the School of Journalism.
I did.
Did you always want to be a writer?
You know, I was actually a really shy little kid. And not so much writing, but I remember going to the library in Hickory and getting in a corner and reading all the Life magazines. It was one of my favorite things to do. And believe it or not, even in college, I loved going to the library and reading old magazines. So I think later in life is when I decided I really wanted to give this a try.
And your book, The Cloudbuster 9, that I mentioned earlier, is about, among other things, baseball.
Right.
Have you always been a fan?
No. The funny thing was my poor father, who literally, the book is about what happened to him, how his baseball career was derailed. But I had a sister, and he had no sons, but all we ever heard about was baseball. And he watch television nonstop down in the basement. It was like a command center. He had 2 televisions. He was a Rain Man for baseball trivia. And when he would start, we would go, oh no, there he goes. He's telling the story about Ted Williams or Johnny Pesky or when he was with the Detroit Tigers. So, but we heard it constantly. So frankly, not really. He never took me to any games. I will tell you a funny story though. Growing up, I played softball and I was terrible. We played in this little old field by a furniture plant. And my poor father would take us to games and he got so frustrated because we would miss the ball. We wouldn't put our foot on the home plate when we came in, and we would score, for the wrong team if we were doing the scoreboard. And it was really frustrating to him. And I never really understood that because I never really understood how high he got in the game and how close he got to making the major leagues. So again, I had mixed feelings about it. We heard it all the time. So not so. I was not much of a baseball fan.
Yeah. But you knew your father played baseball.
Right. Oh, we all did.
Yeah, right. So what inspired you to search more deeply for materials on your father's playing career?
Well, we had always heard it in the background growing up, and he always had a joke and trivia. But when he passed away, it was, I believe, January 1st, 2014, I felt like in his life, I wanted to honor the good parts of his life. And when you lose a parent, my advice is to get as close as you can to that parent, especially as they age. You want to mend fences, and you want people to redeem themselves and feel good about what they did right. So when he passed away, it was interesting because he was always there to fill in the gaps about the baseball stories. And then suddenly he was gone. And my sister said, well, you're going to write the obituary. You've got to deliver the eulogy. And I realized there was no one there to tell us again for the millionth time about his career, about when he struck out Mickey Mantle. So I was there really alone. And that's when I started doing the research. I looked up his stats actually for the very first time on the internet the night he died. And that's really when it started opening scrapbooks and so forth.
Yeah. And can you talk about going through that trunk of his?
Oh yeah. The trunk was down by the TV command center in the basement. It was this big kind of metal trunk, not anything fancy, but we had it around the house forever. I knew it was there, and I opened it up, and I just started looking through the scrapbooks. And the thing that really grabbed me was to see my father with light in his eyes and his youth. You know that as a baseball fan, as a little boy, I'm sure that both of you played, and you know what that's like to have these big dreams. And there's just a real love there on the field. It is that all-American sport. But I saw my father and this little boy, and then he's surrounded by people like Ted Williams and Johnny Pesky, and even I, who knew little about baseball, knew who they were. And I thought, oh boy, he really did have that Captain Marvel experience. But again, I had a lot of compassion for him, and I think that's what kept me going, opening the scrapbooks. And then I found the Navy scrapbook, and it just got bigger from there. But again, that's really when it started. That night was when I took that deep dive. He was actually Sports Illustrated, in papers all over North Carolina. So in sporting news, I couldn't believe that. So I just kept making these discoveries.
And when did you decide to write a book about it?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I think that it really started when I delivered the eulogy, and we had all the scrapbooks and the old baseballs that were signed there. And I've always journaled. I do a lot of that. And the journaling I think it just got me, my conscience. I dreamt about it, and I started really thinking about it, and I was intrigued. I was hooked. And it just kind of grew from there, and I started writing it down, and then I delivered it. And when you deliver a eulogy, you tell a story. And I think that's when it all started coming together into something bigger. And then what happened was, after he passed away, I actually entered a semblance of what the book may look like in something called the Writers League of Texas. It's a statewide contest, and I had no plans to win or even place, because it was really a sad story about what happened to him, and it actually won. And so that the agent that I was fortunate enough to sit down and talk to, because you really got to do this. You have to write this book, and this is what you're going to do. And I said, well, there's one problem. I don't know anything about baseball. And he's like, you can do this. So that's really where the book took root.
And it seems like quite a departure from the writing that you had done before that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've kind of worked in corporate communications.
Yeah.
I've worked in politics. I've done a little creative fiction writing. I had actually written a whole nother book before this, and I worked on that for 6 years. And in a nutshell, after the Civil War, my family went to Brazil. A lot of the Southerners, especially in South Carolina, that's where they were from, around you. They lost their land, they lost everything. And I had 2 branches of my family to go to Brazil. My great-grandmother was born there, Eva Schofield. I'm Ann Schofield Rao. That was my maiden name. So I was named after her, but she was born in Brazil in 71. And her mother died of tuberculosis, and she and her sister were actually given up by their father, who stayed in Brazil for the rest of his life. Again, he was a Confederate, obviously, but he put the 2 sisters on a ship, sent them back to America. He never saw my great-grandmother again. And she settled in North Carolina, right on the South Carolina border. But they wrote for 40 years, and I have all those letters. So I wrote a book about that, and I actually went back down to Brazil, and I've met literally 100 relatives who are Schofields, because Walter Schofield, her father, went on to have 10 more children, and he named them things like Roosevelt in America. So he had this faith in the United States somewhere, but again, he never came back to the United States. But we have the letters. So that book is written. I just felt like, for a variety of reasons, it's not really ready to be released, and maybe one day I'll do so. But again, so this Cloudbuster 9 is my second book.
And getting back to the eulogy, you know, I think you heard me at the introduction talk about the clearness committee moments, or these moments, you know, that are kind of defining in terms of things that need to be done, and, you know, or how they need to be done. You consider that to be that kind of moment for you?
Absolutely. And I think, if there's one thing I want to say, it's this, is our parents. I have a teenage daughter. We do the best that we can. And when someone passes away, you want to honor them with something good. And I felt sorry for my father, because he had been so great. And he was injured. It didn't work out, but he suffered terribly. And I felt like he wasn't very well understood. If I can be candid, I think that people around town may have thought he just told jokes and, you know, this and that. And I remember, you know, at some of the games as a kid, you know, they kind of blew him off, and they said, oh, you know, relax. It doesn't matter if the child doesn't put their foot on the plate, but to him it mattered. And I really, in a way, wanted to redeem him and tell the goodness of his story about some of the better parts of his life. And that was my moment of clarity.
Wow. And why did you have compassion for his failures and disappointments, and how was it that you related to him in this process?
Well, I think I'm the oldest daughter, and again, I was a swimmer. I'm actually still a swimmer. I'm a master's. I'm an old one, but I know what that's like. I think athletics can be really important, and for me, it's something that I need in my life. It just keeps me structured and focused, and when I don't have that, things are not so good. And I think that he had that one thing. And I want to show you a picture of him that I found. Hopefully you can see this, but you know, here he is in the bloom of his youth in high school. And he always said, oh, I was president of my class and this and that. And I never really understood that until I started finding these pictures. But this really spoke to me. And again, I think, you know, I went through school and I went through college and I had dreams. And I think that we all have those. But again, I wanted to honor what was good about him. And frankly, this book that I wrote, I've been very lucky that it has been successful, because it was a dream I always had. But again, and this is important, we're going to fail in life. And that is something that I have learned from these World War II baseball players. That's really important. You know, they were fearless. They expected to fail. And I think that our generation, we have these dreams, we get hurt, we fall down. But again, I had compassion for him.
And with regard to your father specifically, what was his disappointment?
I think that he grew up as this only child with adoring parents who, my mother and I always laughed, they thought he was going to be president of General Motors. They just did. And he was very successful. He went to Haverford Prep School, and then he went to Carolina, and he was president of his class. And, he soared upwards. And then he actually made it into the minor leagues when he signed with the Durham Bulls, and he was on his way. But I think that it just, for him, when he got hurt, and you could see that in the scrapbook, and that's something I want to mention, is when I started looking, I could see him holding his arm. And when you see someone, they're happy, they have this big smile on their face, and they're full of life, and then suddenly you just start seeing that they're losing their life, they're losing that grip. And I could literally follow that in the scrapbook pages. So yeah, I have compassion. We fail. Every day we fail.
So can I get a reaction to a quote, if I give it to you here? So, and see if it relates to your father. Dee Hock was the founder of Visa. And he said, the problem is never how to get new, innovative thoughts in your mind, but how to get the old ones out. Do you think that applies to your father?
Oh yeah, he was haunted. I think that you have to be a really brave person to face down your failures and your weaknesses and deal with them. And oftentimes you need to talk to somebody. You need to get some guidance. And I think that there are people in this world, they're too proud. I think that he came from that generation of, we just don't talk about it. If you get hurt or you're suffering or for whatever. These World War II veterans, who are the Major League World War II veterans, there are about 22 alive today. I've interviewed most of them. They didn't talk about the war. They just didn't do it. So I think, with regard to that quote, it's a matter of facing down your fears and being completely honest.
So what was the biggest surprise that you learned about with your father's baseball career?
This is a small thing, and I just learned this. Let me just tell you something. You write a book, and then you learn all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I just learned a month ago that there's a living bat boy who was in that picture. That
book.
Yeah, he lives in Durham. But one of the things was I found out that my father, when he got out of Carolina, I think it was 1957, he actually pitched against a black team. He moonlighted because he wanted to get the practice. And those guys were remarkable hitters. And someone explained to me, a guy writing another book about the Durham Bulls, he approached me and he said, here's this clip I found about your dad. And there were two other players who played baseball with him at Chapel Hill. And I guess they moonlighted. They'd give them like $20 and they pitched for a game. But I think that was really big of my father to do that. So that was one of the surprises.
Awesome.
Wow. Who were some of the famous names in sports, working, training, and touring with the Navy?
Well, in Chapel Hill, obviously, Ted Williams, and here you go. This is a card that was inspired when he was in Chapel Hill. Here's another one when they played against the Yankees, the team managed by Babe Ruth. But some of the bigger names were Eddie Rickenbacker. He actually came through and toured the pre-flight base. There's a picture of him with my grandfather. John Glenn was with the Navy pre-flight school in Iowa. He was in that 1st Battalion. Gerald Ford, George Bush. Scott Carpenter actually was another, one of the astronauts. He was at St. Mary's pre-flight. Now let's get into the coaches. There's Bear Bryant, Jim Crowley, Bernie Bierman, Tex Oliver, Don Farrow, Bud Wilkinson, Oklahoma, Jim Tatum from UNC. Baseball, there's Charlie Gehringer. I've got one of these. I think these were neat. They had their own Wheaties. I've been collecting these. Jim Crowley, remember him? One of the 4 Horsemen. He was one of the football coaches at Carolina. As far as basketball, John Wooden, the Wizard of Westwood. Frank McGuire, who was a coaching legend at Chapel Hill Navy pre-flight. He was actually one of the athletic instructors. Boxing, there was Jack Dempsey and Gene Tunney. They toured. They would come to boost morale. And I have a picture in my book of Jack Dempsey with a pistol in his pocket. So I don't know, that's what he carried when he toured the campus. But Gerald Ford was one of the boxing coaches at Carolina. I think he taught swimming, boxing, and football. Wrestling, Don George was the world wrestling champion, and he taught hand-to-hand combat, which they taught men, but they also taught the waves. hand-to-hand combat.
Yeah.
These pictures of these women in saddle Oxfords, I love that. And there was a golfer, Willie Ternessa, I believe he was the national amateur golf champion. He was a cadet. Let's see who else. Oh, Larry Snyder, who was Jesse Owens' track coach at Ohio State. He came in and he coached military track. I mean, just to think too, these were very small campuses, and at Chapel Hill they called it Hell's Half Acre. And you and I both went there. I had absolutely no idea all these famous people who were there. But my point is, it was a really small plot of acreage on each of these 5 pre-flight campuses. So you think about all the athletic talent. So you've got Bear Bryant literally rubbing elbows with Gerald Ford, and they're training George Bush, and Ronald Reagan came through. He was at Chapel Hill to entertain the cadets. He wasn't at Navy pre-flight, but I mean, these were really famous men. And there's one more I want to mention. It was Henry Ford II. I believe he was the grandson, but I don't know if you saw the book or saw the movie Ford versus Ferrari, but it's just amazing. And every day, I hate to say it, but I learn about somebody new. But of course, my book is focused on baseball. That's just, a whole new line of celebrities. There were dozens of major league players there.
Well, let's talk about that just for a moment, because one of the things that you say in your book is that the Navy was very shrewd about kind of how they took advantage of the fact that suddenly all of these major leaguers, were in one place at one time, and they could, and despite the fact, which I think is interesting that we don't even think about now, despite all the rationing,
right,
and the restrictions on travel and all that sort of thing, that somehow they worked all of that out, and those guys traveled around and they played, and they really, golly, they did some amazing work for the Navy.
They did. And Kid Brewer, he's a storied name in North Carolina. He was an All-American football player at Duke, but he was the Navy publicist. And, he ran into some troubles later in life, but he was a brilliant man. And he was really the guy behind the curtain, I would say. And he was very careful about running these players like Ted Williams through the drills to get just the right shots. Yeah. My father was part of that, all these bat boys. That was all very well orchestrated because it was for recruiting.
Yeah.
There you have it.
So what did you learn about these people, like Ted Williams, like John Glenn, the World War II era players, Marines, future astronauts? What was your impression?
Well, I'm gonna just tell you, they were human beings, and I had the privilege to get to know Claudia Williams, who was Ted's 3rd child. She's lovely, and she is just like her father, salt of the earth, but real clear-cut, greatest generation World War II values. And part of that is they were fearless. And when I say fearless, they didn't say, "Oh, I need to talk about it. Let me go to a therapist and try to understand, if I should do this." I mean, they just gutted it up and they just did it. And he re-upped twice. I mean, obviously he served as a Marine combat pilot in Korea, so World War II and Korea, but they didn't talk about it so much. They didn't have that privilege. They were humble guys. At the time, there wasn't a lot of money in baseball. A lot of these guys, even the most famous ones, they when they were in the major leagues, one of whom, he said, we got $1.50 a day for a meal allowance, and we just thought that was a fortune. But again, they were fearless. They expected failure. One thing I want to say, like John Glenn, he fully anticipated that he was going to fail. So the challenge was, how do I achieve this without dying, getting killed, getting injured? But they expected failure. And I think, again, today, things are maybe easier for us. We don't go into these challenges expecting to fail. I learned that they were humble. They didn't talk about the war, so with the people that I've interviewed, again, they were humble. They were the good guys, definitely the good guys.
So is there any particular value or values that you particularly identify with?
I think that, here's what I want to say. When I grew up, I came from a small town, and you look at people around you and they say, "Oh, he's such a great man. She's such a beautiful woman. She's so smart." I mean, you hear this and you grow up and you follow in certain footsteps, but sometimes things are easier and sometimes you're doing something that you think you should be doing, but it doesn't feel right.
Mhm.
And so I think that with life, you've got to sort through what you're good at. I would not be a good banker. I'm better at writing and advertising. You have to embrace really what you're good at. And it might not always be the most glamorous thing. If you really want to know the truth, I'm a big nerd. I mean, I love waking up with my dog and having my coffee and reading all these newspapers. And I love to write. I'm probably a little more introverted, but I think that you just need to slowly embrace who you are and just enjoy it. And with children, do the same. Raise your children to embrace what gives them pleasure. And I think when you find things that give you pleasure, you're going to be good at them. That's what I've learned.
So after interviewing all these, great players, have you become in any way, shape, or form a baseball fan?
Oh, absolutely. I will tell you this, though. I think that I'm more of a World War II baseball fan.
Oh, okay.
I mean, obviously, I would love to go to the World Series, and I have met some amazing people. But I think at the end of the day, we all gravitate back to the old days. And I've just met Sharon Robinson, who's Jackie's daughter. I mean, it's just been wonderful.
Cool. So who would you say is the most inspirational person that you've met in this process?
It's funny because I would say that probably Ivan Plesser, and that's not a name that you might know, but he was the surviving pitcher. And I found him, he was 96 years old, and I was writing the book, and I could not imagine that anyone was alive. I mean, I knew Johnny Pesky had passed away a few years earlier, and I was going through the roster, and his name was spelled oddly. And I Googled him and I found him in Michigan. And I thought, surely this isn't the Ivan Plesser. He had just given a speech on World War II baseball. And I found this article and I called the paper. And this woman answered. She goes, "Oh, Ivan, yeah, he lives right down the street. Yeah, he's 96 years old. Here's his phone number." So I called him up, and this is what blew me away. He was really stunned. And he said, "Well, I just really haven't told many people about this." And sure enough, I learned he had hardly told his own daughter about it because he didn't want to brag. But Ivan, he was the pitcher. He served in the war, and he got out, and he decided that he wanted to become a teacher. And he did that for about 40 or 50 years. He was a teacher and a baseball coach. And I flew up to Michigan, sat down with him. He told me the whole story about playing right there with Ted Williams. So I had a witness. He told me everything. And then very sadly, he died about a year later, but I flew back up to Michigan to go to his funeral. It was standing room only, and this just blew me away. Men in their 70s who had been his students had their heads bowed, and they were walking down the center to sit on the front. So all of his old baseball players were there, and it was just remarkable. He was just truly the most inspirational person that I met because he was so humble, and he really embodied, I think, the best of the good guys.
There's another quote I'd love to throw your way, and mostly because you are, late to baseball, and
Really?
But I love it. It's one of my favorite quotes anyway. But I just would love to, if you have a response, it's fine. Leo DeRocher was a long-time manager in Major League Baseball, and he said that baseball is like church. Many attend, but few understand.
I agree with that. I think that, and two, as baseball becomes more of a social medium, back in the day, all the generations used to gather together, and this is exactly what the quote is about, and they would watch the sport, and they loved it. The longer the game, the better the game. And they sat in the sun and they enjoyed their hot dogs and they talked to their parents and their friends. I mean, there was a community there. And they were their heroes, especially during the Depression and really tough times. And these kids, like my father, really looked up to Ted Williams because they gave them hope. And it was like going to church. I absolutely agree with that. And sadly, I think that it's becoming more televised. And I do know, based on some of the players that I've spoken with, they feel like, who does live up to these expectations, because there's so much media and it's kind of I don't know, diluted what it was. But yeah, it is like going to church. I would agree with that. It's sacred to some people.
Yeah, it is.
Like to you, I can tell.
Wow, that's great. On the heels of this great work, what are you working on now?
Well, I'm doing more stories right now. I'm trying to interview the last of the surviving Major League World War II veterans. And right now we're down to about 23. Eddie Robinson is the oldest. Today he'll be 99 in about a week. And this is a crazy story. I've located a gentleman by the name of Val Heim, and he was a pitcher for the White Sox in 1942. He had been a cattle rancher in Nebraska. He was the oldest living Major League Baseball player. And I interviewed him, and the story ran about a month ago. Very sadly, we lost him about 2 weeks ago.
Mhm.
But he was just great. He said he was herding cattle until he was, I think he said 93 years old. You know, I mean, so he just had a real grit about him, a lot of integrity. So that, at this point, do I have a book? I'm not really sure. But what I'm trying to do as quickly as possible is get some of the untold stories. I'm trying to get down beneath what we all know and just really find out what that was like riding on the bus with Jackie Robinson, knowing Ted Williams, you know, what those friendships were like. So at this point, I'm writing as many articles as possible on these surviving players.
Okay, that's awesome.
Who are your favorite players?
Well, I'm a Mets fan, but you know, there's nothing to brag about since about 1986.
Yeah.
So you know, who are my favorite players? I mean, you mean like during my whole life, you know, the Mets, the '69 Mets who won the World Series. I mean, I did see Mickey Mantle play. I saw Willie Mays play. I saw some great players. And that was just because of my dad. You know, he had these tickets. Come on, let's go. You know, and so I had this amazing privilege. You know, in the '60s and '70s.
And what about you?
Oh, you know, I remember when I was in third grade and we had Jose Canseco cards we were exchanging, and then it kind of got up to where baseball wasn't huge in our family. My dad wasn't a huge baseball fan, but my mom's dad was a great baseball fan. And so I used to hear the stories. In fact, it's so funny that baseball and church kind of got mentioned together. He got in trouble for going to a baseball game from the church because they thought he was worldly, and he was a Sunday school teacher. But he was a big baseball fan because it was exactly as you described. It was such a communal event, and it brought people together so well. And so I just got to hear the stories kind of on the tail end of his life and how he enjoyed it, and almost looked backwards with reverie, wishing that I could be in an era when it was like that and not so commercialized as you've described.
Right. I love the way that both of you just lit up when you told those stories.
Oh, yeah.
It's like your little boys again.
You know, in my case, I was a Mets fan because my grandmother was a Mets fan. And so she watched every game and I watched every game with her. And that was an interesting transition too. We moved from New Jersey down to North Carolina.
Oh.
And she was, golly, about 100-ish.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, Mets fan, diehard, you know, bleed blue and orange, you know, I mean, the whole thing. And then we couldn't get the Mets on TV, but we could get the Cubs. Immediately, she's this huge Cubs fan. And I was just like, wait a minute, you know.
Oh.
So now I'm watching, you know, Cubs with her. And, you know, so anyway. I think I got a lot of my love of baseball from my grandmother.
Well, you know, you mentioned the Mets. This is a really interesting thing that I barely touch on in my book, but Phil Regan, Regan, I believe he was brought out, he's in his 80s. He played with my dad, I believe, with the Birmingham Barons. They may have even been roommates. I think they were.
Well,
but he was now brought back later in life as one of the pitching coaches this year for the Mets. I believe that's correct. So I'd love to have a conversation with him because he's the guy. I mean, you know, at his age, 83 years old, that's amazing.
That is, absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. You know, my dad was from that greatest generation. And it's been so hard, you know, the last 20 years just watching these people just die off, and, you know, just watching this whole amazing generation that just like we're unworthy, you know.
Oh, totally. I'm totally unworthy. I mean, there's no question. I just did an interview with the Bob Feller Foundation, and I just said I'm unworthy. But what I did do was I found an interview that he had done a few years before he passed away. And I love this because I looked at the interview, and he said at the very end, they said, Mr. Feller, is there anything you'd like to pass on to the next generation? Any advice? And he said, well, read the Constitution and abide by the Constitution. And then they came back and they said, is there anything else? He said, read the Constitution and live by it, abide by it. I'm hanging up. And he hung up the phone. So it's very simple.
Yes.
I mean, they were straight shooters. That's just the way they were.
Yes, they were. Well, we are just so grateful to be able to spend time with you. It's wonderful. I didn't get the chance to meet you when you came to Greenville, so now I at least can meet you by Zoom.
Oh, of course. Well, I'm really honored to do this, and I think that it's just one way to carry this message.
I know individuals who, they have a burden for this kind of, living record keeping, and I think it's just terribly important. And so I commend you for the work that you're doing.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.